So just to catch you up, like on part one, talked about like the different types of societies, moving into the industrial society, what was going on um, in the country at that particular time, as far as like what was happening with labor, with people going to work in the factories or whatnot, women going to work, or men going to work, women actually getting control of the household, um, the railroads, the canals, people moving, ideas moving, and reform movements started to pop off. So it was like temperance movement. They was like outlawing liquor. They were doing education reform because they had factories and stuff, so they needed employees that had a certain type of intellectual capacity. Um, it went to it went from there to um, the anti-slavery movement and also the women's rights movement. So um, it moved. It talked about what was different about America at the time was American modernization, um, and what was causing modernization, which was like what was the atmosphere, like the ideology behind like advancing, like all those inventions that were coming out, stuff like that. So it talked about like who was behind the movements, and surprisingly, a lot of those reform movements came from like women actually having like control of their own space and ideas. With the man leaving to go to work every day, and the women having like full control of the domestic space, they had a lot of influence in terms of like what they was going to teach the kids. So, um, of course, with modernization, that produced like social tensions. So with those social tensions, you had to understand there was a lot going on. So mainly when it comes to this reparations debate, right, when we talking slaves in America, then you're looking at two culprits. You got the Catholic Church and you got the 13 colonies, or it's live. I can't really, it's live.
Yeah, start.
So with that being said, we're gonna go ahead and catch right back up. So when we talk about the Catholics versus the Protestants, which was part of the reason why a lot of people made their migration from Europe to America. Um, the Catholics, and we're talking about reform and modernization at the same time. The Catholics are largely anti-reform. So the Catholic Irish in both Ireland and America, they had experienced extreme poverty and oppression, and within the Irish, it had produced a profound sense of pessimism. So the Irish people and Catholics in general, they had been under so much oppression that they didn't even, see the benefit in modernization. Since others possessed all the wealth and power, the practice of self-discipline or self-denial and investment in the future seemed pointless to them. So the Catholics didn't believe that reform or progress could lead to improvement for either individuals or society. The Roman Catholic doctrine, or excuse me, the Roman Catholic doctrine in itself reinforced conservatism directly in opposition of Protestant reform minded progressive ideology. So the Protestants were the progressives, the Catholics were the conservatives. Most of these Catholics were lower class, and the reform minded Yankee Protestants were predominantly in the upper and middle class. Also, the Yankees already viewed the German and the Irish immigrants with suspicion. So the distrust was reciprocal. In the Midwest, the division was between the Butternuts and the Yankees. So in the far East Coast, if you see the movie Gangs of New York, you can get an understanding of what was going on the East Coast. As far as the Midwest, we get another group of, or we get introduced to a group of people called the Butternuts. So The butternuts of the southern Midwest was another anti modernization subculture. They wore homespun clothing dyed with an extract from butternuts or walnuts. They were mostly Methodist and Baptist of Southern origin, and they developed largely a rural economy based on corn, hogs, and whiskey. The Yankee the Yankees arrived later to the Midwest and developed and diversified commercial agriculture. Yankee Midwesterners had gained control of all the major economic institutions in their states, like banks, railroads, and commercial enterprises and industries. So basically, the Yankees who had moved from New York moved to the Midwest because it was wide open territory, and they grabbed control of all the banks and all the things that would make them millionaires and of that upper echelon. So the Midwestern Yankees had also organized temperance movements, anti-slavery movements, and other reform movements. So the Yankee areas were ahead of the butternut areas in every index of modernization, including economic growth, schools, literacy, railroad, commerce, rate of urbanization, technological innovation, and support for measures favoring social and economic change. The politics in these Midwestern states and Northern states are marked over with the bitter conflicts over banking, corporate charters, temperance legislation, anti-agitation, and anti-Negro measures. So um, the butternuts, which is a like I just described, which is another group of anti-modernization people. So you had the Catholics on one side who didn't see the point in progressing. People who were Catholic came from Ireland and places like that, so they had always been oppressed by the Catholic Church. They didn't see the point in like planning for the future or trying to be progressive. The Protestants, which were the people who had like left Europe and came over here, they were all about the future, ingenuity. The Butternuts were another group of subculture that was anti-modernization, and they lived in the Midwest. But the Yankees at the time who were leaving like New York area, Boston area, going toward the Midwest, they were all about like modernization and progress. So they grabbed control of like the banks and all the things that would put them in power. And they just kind of took over. It's all good. What? Yeah, nah, it's all good. Like I guess it just like bringing the internet into our world a little bit. And the babies in the background. But so the butternuts were consistently hostile to banks, corporations, temperance, and butternuts didn't like black people. Another schism that divided along class lines as workers experienced a growth in class consciousness. Among wage earners, they began to realize that they didn't share equally with other segments of society in the economic benefits and markets of modernization. So you see the emergence of child labor in the textile industry. You see there's kids working in the factory at this particular time. Sweatshop conditions for women in the garment industry in the big cities. Low wage occupations for new immigrants, women, and children. It created a substantial group of workers who earned less than a living wage and could only make ends meet if several family members went to work. That's why you always hear grandma and them tell them stories about how they went to work at age 14 because it was the only way to make it work. So keep in mind that the whole concept of wages seemed alien to the American notion of independence and equality among white men. So there's another ideology at this time called the Jeffersonian ideology, and during that era, the great majority of white males they owned their means of production, and they owned the tools of their trade. But after 1815, more and more men owned nothing more than their labor, or their hand power, their manpower, which they sold to employers in return for wages. So that was an entirely new concept of I'll go to work and sling this hammer for you, for 8 hours a day, for 12 hours a day, for a certain amount of pay. prior to that, it was like, nah, I want to own my tools. I want to own my workshop. I'll be a blacksmith. I'll make hammers and I'll bring them to the market and I'll sell them. And you could trade me, a pig for a hammer. So, things was changing. So those who worked for wages, they were dependent on a living wage and dependent on the owner of the business who pays them. They weren't equal in status or in independence to the boss or the capitalist. Skilled craftsmen, skilled craftsmen, they actually resented that. You got to think if you spent years developing a craft and then now you have to like go work for like less than a living wage, you would pretty much like hate that system. So they hated machines. They hated pretty much everything that had to do with modernization. But modernization also had political consequences. Um, it's perhaps one of the most underpublicized yet impactful changes in the 1830s that produced the two-party system that's now like a permanent feature of American politics. Um, the Democrats inherited the Jeffersonian commitment to states' rights. States' rights meaning limited government and traditional economic arrangements and religious pluralism. Democrats were mostly Catholic and butternuts in the North. Farmers on poor soils and those less involved in the market economy leaned toward the Democrats because it addressed their fears and resentments for modernization. So, the democratic ideology of Jeffersonian agrarians, small governments, states' rights, and territorial expansion best suited the interests of the South and slavery. Democrats also believed in the removal of Indians from their lands east of the Mississippi. The other party at the time was the Whigs. They inherited the Federalist belief of nationalism, strong government, economic innovation, cultural homogeneity under the auspices of established Protestant denominations. So the Protestants were mostly of New England and British birth. Whigs were most prevalent in urban areas and in prosperous farming regions linked by good transportation to the market economy. Whig ideology spoke explicitly to the hopes of Americans. Whigs also believed in the country's expansion over time by means of economic growth and modernization. So then we hear this term called the antebellum South. We just got a description of what was going on in the North, what was going on in the Midwest, and then now we're about to get introduced to the South, which is called antebellum South. So antebellum is a compound word from the mid 1800s, derived from the Latin word anti, meaning before, and bellum, meaning war. So when they say antebellum South, it just means before the war. So the economy in the slave states remained rural and agricultural while the North was rapidly modernizing. The economy did not develop a substantial commercial and industrial sector. The commitment to education in the South was weak, and nearly half of its population was illiterate. The slave states valued tradition and stability more than change and progress. Southern separatism was rooted in the resistance to the Northern vision of what America should become. The South was simply anti-North in every regard. In 1860s, in 1860, Massachusetts produced more manufactured goods than all of the future Confederate states combined. New York and Pennsylvania reached production output more than double the Confederate amount. New York had nearly half as much banking capital in 1860 as all 15 slave states combined. Southerners contributed to 7% of the important inventions from 1790 to 1860. Even the inventor of the cotton gin, which revolutionized the Southern economy, was a Massachusetts man named Eli Whitney, who had gone to Georgia in 1792. A large portion of Southern college professors, academy principals, tutors, and newspaper editors came from the North. Now, for a moment, let's examine the South as a colonial empire. The growing, the growing of staple crops for the world market dominated the Southern economic life ever since the Virginia experiments with tobacco. Four fifths of colonial exports to England before 1776 came from southern colonies. Tobacco from Virginia and Maryland, rice, indigo, and naval stores from the Carolinas and Georgia. Whitney's invention of the cotton gin made the growing com- or the invention of the cotton gin made the commercial growing of short staple cotton feasible, while the rise of the textile industry in New England created a vast new demand for cotton. So the invention of the cotton gin meant that they could grow more cotton and process it. And then the expansion in the north of all the factories meant that they could spin it into shirts, fabric, and whatever else they're making. So southern plantations doubled their cotton output each decade from 1800 to 1860. Cotton alone accounted for more than half of all American exports from 1815 to 1860. Those defending slavery in the South argued that King Cotton ruled the economy. However, much of the capital and entrepreneurship to finance the market of Southern crops came from outside the South. Introduced a job title called the Cotton Factor. That was a certain type of commission merchant. The origins of factoring date back to the colonial period when tobacco importing firms from London sent their agents to Virginia to buy and ship the crop. The factor advanced credit to the planter with future crops as collateral, and it functioned as the planter's purchasing agent to obtain consumer goods from London or elsewhere. So the cotton factors was making like a commission off the cotton. Basically, the whole country is revolving around cotton. And the system of factoring had adapted itself to cotton in the 1800s, except the factors became increasingly northern rather than British. The factor took a charge of the planter's crop once it reached Memphis or New Orleans or Charleston or Mobile or Savannah, Georgia, and he provided storage facilities and contracted for transportation and sale to the ultimate purchaser. The total amount of the commission, including interest, might be as much as 20% of the crop, especially if the planter went into debt, as many of them did. Factoring represented a drain of wealth from the South, estimated between 100 and 150 million dollars annually in the late antebellum period. Financially, the South was more enslaved than its Negroes. In 1852, Southerners revived the Southern Commercial Convention and met annually throughout the South throughout the rest of the 1850s. Its purpose was to promote the construction of Southern capital for the construction of railroads, steamship lines, port facilities, banks, factories, and other enterprises to achieve economic independence from the North. The achievement of the Southern Commercial Convention turned out to be more political than economic. The convention basically became a forum for Southern secessionists. So as early as 1850, these crowds had started going out in the South for the South to succeed throughout this Southern Commercial Convention. So the question, I guess, would be, why did the South fail to modernize?
You asking me?
Yeah,
Um,
I'm asking you and I'm asking whoever watching this video to ask themselves, why did the South fail to modernize? I mean, you look at this graphic right here. They're growing cotton pretty much from here in North Carolina all the way down through South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana. Rice in some parts, tobacco up there, hemp. Don't forget hemp, which is making a comeback, and that was one of the staple crops, back then in the 1800s. So you might want to get into, hemp for anybody tuning into this video. So
you show me.
what that graphic
Mm.
um, right here, principal staple crop regions of the South in 1860. Rice right here along the coast in Charleston, Savannah, and right here in North Carolina. What's that, like Wilmington? cotton, sugar, um, percentage of slaves in total population. If you look right here, these black areas mean that all these areas had more than 50%, excuse me, had more than 50% slaves of their total population. In the South down here, Indian Indian Territory, which is currently Oklahoma, New Mexico Territory, Utah Territory, Nebraska. So the question once again is, why did the South fail to modernize?
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, it's because of slaves. Slaves were both capital and labor. On a typical plantation, the investments in slaves was greater than the investments in land and in implements combined. Slave agriculture could not follow the path blazed by northern agriculture because capital intensive, or because slavery was more capital intensive. Paradoxically, an increase in capital became an increase in labor. So instead of investing in substantial sums of machinery, a planter invested into more slaves. So westward expansion caused the southern economy to grow, but not develop. The South also failed to develop a substantial urban middle class and skilled labor population. The South also failed to diversify its economy, producing a wide variety of goods and services. Basically, slavery caused the South to be backwards. It inhibited Southern development. Because slaves and other kinds of personal and real property were counted as wealth, the South furnished 60% of the nation's wealthiest men. Yet slavery was not profitable for small scale farmers. Generally speaking, the slave states lacked the characteristics of the free labor community, including an abundance and variety of skilled labor, a home market for a variety of crops, dense settlements, and a large body of small proprietors, meaning like small business people. The North had improvements in their transportation structure, which was like the railroads and the canals that we talked about in part one. They had better buildings, churches, schoolhouses, mills, roads, canals, bridges, better clothes, higher education among its people. Um, they were pretty much just winning in every regard up north. The South's failure to modernize its economy came as a result of too much economic dependence on a single staple crop, cotton. The increased price of cotton following the 1837 and 1843 depression, the price of cotton went from 5 cents per pound to 11 cents per pound throughout the 1850s. So planters set new production records year after year. But this success also bid up the price of slaves, which nearly doubled during the 1850s and thereby absorbed most of the available capital in the South. If you were a cotton planter, where the accumulated if you ask the cotton planter where were the accumulated profits from cotton, he will point to his Negroes and almost nothing else, because that's where all his spare cash was sunk into purchasing more Negroes to make more cotton. So Southern economic values also inhibited economic development. Entrepreneurial ethic was a form of vulgar Yankee materialism. The Southern ideal image of itself was country gentlemen practicing the arts of gracious living, hospitality, leisure, the ride and the hunt, chivalry towards women, honor among equals, and kindness toward inferiors. This we know was not the reality. As we examine slavery in the United States, consider the division of slave labor. 10% of the slaves worked in mining, transportation, construction, lumbering, and industry. 15% of slaves were domestic servants or performed non agricultural labor. Among the remaining 75%, 55% raised cotton, 10% raised tobacco, 10% sugar, rice, or hemp. After the division of slave labor, consider the makeup of the ownership class. Only 33% of Southern whites owned slaves. and nearly half of that 33% owned fewer than five slaves. So really, only 15% of Southern white people own pretty much the majority of all slaves. So it's not like how they try to perpetrate it or make it seem like everybody was just owning slaves. Most white people couldn't even afford slaves. So if only 12% of owners owned more than half of all Negroes, what state did all the other whites who fought in the Civil War have in defending slavery and maintaining that way of Southern life if only 12% of whites own more than half of all Negroes? I mean, that's a serious question. What did they have to fight for? Um, it was not equitable or beneficial to anyone except for the large landholding planters. When the situation was analyzed by sociologist Pierre L. van de Brere, he coined the term Herrenvolk democracy. The term Herrenvolk democracy describes the rationalization for slavery and white supremacy, the equal superiority of all who belong to the Herrenvolk or master race over all who do not. Southern whites were not profiting from the slave system. Their children were mostly illiterate, and the living standards were low, but they still defended the status quo in the South. Not all Southern whites owned slaves, but they all owned white skins. So, however much non slaveholders disliked slavery, few could see any other means of maintaining white supremacy. Some quotes from the period sum up the thoughts of whites in the dominant society. Now suppose they was free. You'd see they'd all think themselves as good as we. How'd you like to have a nigger feeling just as good as a white man? How'd you like to have a nigger stepping up to your daughter? Wish there weren't no niggers. They're a great cuss to this country, but it wouldn't never do no good to freedom and leaves them here. I don't know anybody hardly in favor of that. Make them free and leaves them here, and they'd steal everything we made. Nobody's could live here then. From childhood, the one thing in their condition which has made life valuable to the mass of whites has been the niggers are yet their inferiors. And that quote was from Frederick Law Olmsted. Google him. John C. Calhoun said, "The two great divisions of society are not the rich and poor, but white and black, and all the former, the poor as well as the rich, belong to the upper class, and are respected and treated as equals, and hence have a position and pride of character of which neither poverty nor misfortune can deprive them." Governor Joseph E. Brown of Georgia said that slavery is the poor man's best government because the poor white laborer is respected as an equal. He belongs to the true aristocracy, the race of white men. So basically, slavery for many whites was the foundation of liberty and equality. But why? What were the economic and social conditions of slavery? We've all seen the movies, but factually speaking, chattel bondage gave the master great power over his slaves to buy, sell, and punish without sanction of the courts, to separate families, to exploit sexually, even to kill with little fear of being held legally responsible. Slaves could not legally marry, nor own property, nor be taught to read or write in most states. Owners might let them have a family or earn money or, in rare cases, buy their freedom. Slavery was both an economic and a human institution. The master's power over his slave was often tempered by his economic self interest and sometimes by paternalism. Therefore, dead, maimed, brutalized, or runaway slaves could not perform tasks. Just like any other employee employer relationship, persuasion, inducement, reward for good work, and concessions were necessary in order for the institution to function. Slaves spoke the same language and worshiped the same Christian God as their owners. Relations of trust and affection, as well as alienation and hatred, could all exist between slave and master. This helped to neutralize its dehumanizing tendencies and to give the slaves latitude to create cultural institutions that sustained them through generations of bondage. Remember, the United States had outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 and 1808, so they needed a well maintained slave population in order to maintain the economic base. Slavery in the United States generally operated with less harshness than in most parts of the Western world. On Caribbean plantations and Brazilian coffee plantations, life was short, nasty, and brutish for slaves. Food, clothing, medical care, and the material necessities for life were often less abundant, and the pace of work was brutally demanding. So when it comes to this reparations debate, I mean, we're gonna have some talks about Latin America because they have a real gripe to claim with the Catholic Church, and I don't know if they're signing up for that because a lot of them are, you know, into Catholicism heavy. But slavery in the Caribbean and South America flourished while the slave trade was still open. In the United States, the cutoff of imports made planters dependent on natural reproduction for the maintenance and increase of their slave stock. The quasi formation of slave families also helped to prevent against insurrection. In 1865, the black population in the US was 10 times the number of Africans who had been imported and represented 30% of the hemisphere's black population. Latin American nations considered it cheaper to import slaves from Africa and literally work them to death than to create an environment where slaves could maintain their population. And they mostly imported males into Latin America, so they didn't have the formation of those slave families like we often see on those historical movies. So everything in nature has a cause and effect relationship. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. In a modernizing society, status depends on achievement as well as on description. Slavery undermined the work ethic among Southern whites. When most kinds of manual labor is associated with bondage, work becomes servile rather than honorable. Slavery discourages manufacturers. The poor despise labor when it's performed by slaves. My state is in destitute of every feature which characterizes industrialist people. That was said by William Gregg. He was a South Carolina industrial. Not only did slavery affect the white population, slave labor was also reluctant labor. Evidence suggests that slaves engaged in slowdowns and careless practices as a form of resistance to compulsory labor. They feigned illnesses, ceased work when the overseer looked the other direction, and pretended to misunderstand orders. They broke tools, abused work animals, and ran away into the woods or swamps. Slavery caused the technological lag in Southern agriculture. What need is it to invent machines and make things work more efficiently when you could simply deploy another slave? Effectively, the immorality of slavery was the principal cause of Southern backwardness. Slavery is the most ancient and universal form of labor in the history of civilization. Philosophy and religion in the pre modern era justified slavery as one of many forms of subordination to authority necessary for social order. But the second half of the 1700s produced four currents of Anglo American and French thought that converged to form the basis for an emergent international anti slavery movement. The first development was the growth in post Reformation radical Protestant denominations, especially the Quakers. So the growth in those Protestant denominations, especially the Quakers, is one of the main reasons why the anti-slavery movement picked up steam. Quakers founded Quakers founded the first American anti-slavery population. Hold on, give me that back. That microphone go inside of that. Like you put all that trash in there. I need that. That's what the microphone go inside of.
The polar bear.
Yeah. Just let me clean the table off when I finish. No matter. All right. So the Quakers founded the first American anti-slavery organization, the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. The second development was the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment philosophy questioned slavery's place in a social order and designed to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So the third development was laissez-faire economic theory. It rejected feudal and mercantilist restrictions on free enterprise and free labor. Adam Smith's The Wealth of the Nation addressed the labor of slaves. Though it appears to only cost their maintenance, is in the end the dearest of any. Any person who can acquire no property can have no interest but to eat as much and labor as little as possible. The fourth development was the Age of Revolutions. That was 1775 to 1825. It produced the abolition of slavery in all of the Union North and Maryland, in the French West Indies, and in most of Latin American countries, or during that same time period, most Latin American countries have won their independence from Spain. In 1808, we have the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in Britain and in the United States. But on the other hand, slavery still survived in the United States, Brazil, and Cuba. And where it survived, it thrived. The increasing production, respectively, of cotton, coffee, and sugar after 1800 almost entrenched the institution more firmly than ever. The expansion of slavery in these countries produced a slave population in the Western Hemisphere larger in 1850 than it had been in 1800. Americans and the nationals of other countries that participated in a flourishing illicit slave trade from Brazil to Cuba. But if those in the United States were going to free slaves, there were two emerging ideologies of what to do with the free black population: colonization versus abolition. Whites feared the racial consequences of letting loose a large number of black people whose assumed inferiority and savage instincts would constitute a threat to society. In 1817, Henry Clay and Bushrod Washington, a nephew of George Washington, formed the American Colonization Society. The society acquired land in West Africa and formed the country of Liberia as a haven for free black Americans whose transportation and settlement there the society financed. We also have the emergence of militant abolitionism led by the Calvinist revolutionists. Calvinism is an activist faith. It requires its subscribers to crusade against sin, infidelity, Sabbath breaking, prostitution, intemperance, and enslavement of human beings. The Puritan doctrine of collective accountability and collective judgment. Every man is his brother's keeper. All Americans were accountable as long as one American had slaves. By 1838, there were 1,350 such auxiliaries. With a total membership of 250,000, these societies published pamphlets in newspapers, sponsored lectures, and gathered signatures on petitions for actions against slavery. Militant abolitionists rejected colonization as a pro slavery trick to strengthen the institution. For them, there was no compromising with sin. The South closed its mind to the abolitionist thought. It wasn't even an option. Most Northerners did not accept the abolitionist message of total emancipation and equal rights. President Andrew Jackson instructed the Postmaster General to ban abolitionist literature from the mails on the grounds that might cause that it may cause rebellion. Northern mobs attacked abolitionist lectures, destroyed, de- destroyed their printing presses, and burned abolitionist property in the 1830s. These mobs were made up of lower class whites who feared that emancipation would loose a horde of blacks to come north and compete with them for jobs and equality. Some mobs included gentlemen of property and standing, merchants, and lawyers committed to social order. Social issues always appear in politics. Now, with the emergence of the two party political system and the two major parties being the Democrats and the Whigs, yet the politics of abolitionism produced a third party in the North, the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party grew out of the American Missionary Association, and that organization grew out of the efforts of the Tappan brothers to win freedom of Africans who were captured on the slave ship Amistad. There's a popular movie that Hollywood did about the Amistad. The Amistad was carrying slaves to Cuba, and it was overtaken by the slaves and steered to Long Island instead. There, abolitionists took up their cause and carried the case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court declared the Africans to be free. The abolitionists repatriated them back to their homeland. The organization later became the principal agency for bringing education to freed slaves in the American South. So we begin to see a correlation between anti slavery and modernization. All the principal founders of the anti slavery and abolitionist movements were natives of Massachusetts or Connecticut. The English Quaker families, such as the Darbys, Lloyds, Barclays, Wedgwoods, were the vanguard of the Industrial Revolution and furnished many 1700s British anti slavery leaders. Survey of the origins of abolitionists, where 55% were businessmen and clergymen. The free labor ideology, the abolitionist entrepreneur correlation, was no coincidence. The capitalist ideology was a free labor ideology. The internalized self discipline of the Protestant ethic created more efficient workers than the coercive external discipline of the lash of slavery. The positive incentives of free labor are wages or advancement, and that would motivate the masses to avoid the negative incentive of poverty. Horace Greeley wrote, "The whip only stimulates the flesh on which it is laid. It does not reach the parts of the man where lie the springs of action. Enslave a man, and you destroy his ambition, his enterprise, his capacity. In the constitution of human nature, the desire of bettering one's condition is the mainspring effort." So now we have to examine, or the last thing we're going to look at is the ideology of the South, which is a counterattack on all of the perspectives that we just heard that was going on in the North. Um, so the South went from slavery being a necessary evil to a positive good. During the same time period, the South underwent some ideological changes. So it went from being a necessary evil to a positive good because of the phenomenal growth of the Cotton Kingdom in the 1830s. The argument became that all great societies rested on slavery and serfdom. From ancient Egypt to biblical Israel to Greece and Rome, the France of Charlemagne, the England of the Magna Carta, etc. There's no respectable system of civilization known to history whose foundations were not laid on the institution of domestic slavery. That was said by Senator R.N.T. Hunter of Virginia. So some of these names that we're throwing out, it's worth putting a pin in them or writing them down because these are the main culprits when it comes to the reparations argument. So one argument was the wage slavery theme. Slavery protagonists claimed that blacks enjoyed a higher standard of living than the wage earner or the wage slaves of the northern factories. Southern slaves never suffered from unemployment or wage cuts. They received free medical care. They were taken care of in old age rather than cast out to starve or depend on charity. Nowhere in the South did one see such scenes of beggary, squalid poverty, and wretchedness. The South also had a cavalier image of itself. Southern planters viewed their class as an aristocracy of virtue, of generosity and courage. The habit of command was instilled in the youth of slaveholding families. Planters subscribed to the code of chivalry with its requirements of honor, courtesy, chivalry towards women, and noblesse oblige. The white supremacy ideology at the time allowed Southerners to subscribe to the notion that planters were descended from the Cavaliers and Yankees were descended from the Roundheads or the Puritans. The Cavaliers in this theory were the descendants of Norman knights who had conquered Saxon England in the 11th century, while the Puritans descended from those conquered Saxons. Dueling was linked to the South aristocratic code of honor. The Southern's reliance on personal action rather than law to avenge insult. More Southerners than Northerners fought in the Mexican American War. The principal generals were Southerners from 1841 to 1860, and the general in chief of the U.S. Army was a Southerner. All four secretaries of war from 1849 to 1860 were Southerners. The proportion of Southerners admitted to West Point and regular Army office was 30% greater than the South proportion of the nation's population. 11 of the cadets who had been there at West Point together in 1828 and 1829 became top generals or leaders in the Confederacy, including Robert E. Lee, Albert Sidney Johnson, Joseph E. Johnson, and Jefferson Davis. There were large numbers of military schools in the South, the Virginia Military Institute, the Citadel, etc. In fact, according to the 1860 census, there were 5 times as many military colleges in the South as the North. The purpose of the South's armed readiness was for the control of slaves. A central feature in Southern life was the slave patrol. This usually consisted of 3 to 4 mounted white men who patrolled each night to apprehend slaves without passes and prevent secret gatherings. This is the origin of the police who go on patrol. 50 or so men would be on rotation, and these patrols included non slaveholders, and this formed another link that bound Southern whites to the slave system. Southern whites lived in constant fear of an uprising. After the Nat Turner Revolt of 1831, Southern states imposed new restrictions on both blacks and whites to preserve order. Nearly every state passed laws limiting freedom of speech, specifically against speeches and writings having a tendency to promote discontent among free colored people or insubordination among slaves. Even northern visitors to the South fell victim to mob violence, including lynchings. There was also the case of Denmark Vesey and Gabriel Prosser. The volunteer military companies were preparedness to put down any slave insurrection. So the last the last thing I guess is slavery into the national politics scene, and that's where we're gonna wrap this one up. Slavery was the main issue in national politics from 1844 until the start of the Civil War in 1860-1861. So for 15 years, slavery dominated the national politics scene. The Democratic Party, the Democratic Party served as the main political bulwark of slavery. The Democrats defended slavery, and the Jacksonian were the Democrats were the backbone of the party. In 1828, Andrew Jackson had won 71% of the popular vote in the slave states. The Jacksonians rewarded their Southern supporters. 3 of Jackson's 4 appointees to the Supreme Court were Southerners. Martin Van Buren, who was Andrew Jackson's successor, appointed 2 Southern justices, but no Northerners to the court. So that means following Andrew Jackson's presidency and Martin Van Buren's presidency, there were 5 Southerners appointed to the Supreme Court. And that's going to become extremely important because there's a Supreme Court case of, I can't think of the name, but it's the main case that defines the status of Black people. let's see. We'll go to Google right quick and we'll find out what's the name of that case. Supreme Court case, slavery. Um, the Dred Scott decision. You heard of that, or you remember that?
I was looking it up.
Yeah, the Dred Scott decision. So when it comes to the Dred Scott decision, which was in 1857, five of those judges that had been appointed was from the southern states that came from the Jacksonian Democrats. But back to Andrew Jackson's actions as president, he vetoed bills to recharter the second bank of the United States. Remember, Southerners were against the big banks. He vetoed bills to appropriate funds for road construction, and that pleased the Southern proponents of states' rights. His willingness to ban anti-slavery materials from the mail, and then the congressional Democrats and the gag rule, which was a resolution that barred the reception of an anti-slavery petition in the House of Representatives. So from 1836 to 1844, they had actually gagged any congressman or senator that wanted to put forth anti-slavery legislation. So that sets the scene pretty much leading up to like 1845, 1850, and we like 10 years, I guess, ahead of the Civil War. So we're gonna see if it's any reference material to hit. If not, we'll pick back up on the next one with Texas, Mexico, and the Compromise of 1850. Appreciate y'all tuning in. And we'll make sure we be right back tomorrow with another edition so we can um, get to the real culprits about this slavery thing so we can see where these reparations need to come from. All right, peace.